Thanks very much. Um, all right, so it's a pleasure to be back here with all of you today. I'm going to start off this session on data sources by going over contemporary data, and then Chenzi is going to pick up next on historical data. And so my session is actually going to pick up something related to what Matteo was talking a lot about yesterday, that a lot of questions in international finance and macro are really about understanding who owns what or who owes what to whom. And so what I want to do here is basically give a very brief overview and allow plenty of time for questions on where you would actually start getting the data. And so I'm going to go over what I think are kind of the most prominent and important publicly available data sets in the field. I'll also try to give some suggestions for commercially available microdata, but please, ask me anything and everything about these data sets. So I'm going to frame what I'm talking about through the organization of the country's international investment position. And so basically from the IMF, you can access the balance of payments and a country's international investment position. Now what this is it's basically a country level. So for every country, it's what are their assets and liabilities on a multilateral level. And so what multilateral really means is if you're looking at the US, you can say this is how many foreign stocks or foreign bonds or foreign loans the US owns, but you can't say, this is where the investment takes place. It's from the perspective of the country as a whole. More recent data disaggregates to finer and finer categories, but it's fundamentally a multilateral data set. Now, there are kind of five main components of the balance of payments that are going to make up a country's assets and liabilities. So portfolio investment, which is what I'm going to mostly focus on here, is stocks and bonds. If you own them, they're your assets. If somebody else owns yours, they're your liabilities. Other is actually a large category because other actually contains bank loans. And so if you're ever looking at the balance of payments and you want to see where the bank loans are, they're inside of this other. Also, I'm going to foreign direct investment.
I think you're maybe sharing a different screen because we're still just looking at the title slide.
Oh, really?
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No. That is great to know here. Let me try again. Thanks, Chenzi. So let me share the whole desktop instead of Adobe. How's this now?
That's great.
Good?
Thanks.
Great. And so the components of a country's international investment position are these five categories. Now, kind of building on something that Brent discussed yesterday, when you really talk about, is a country a net creditor or debtor, what you're really looking at is a country's total foreign assets. This is for the United States. I plotted it in blue, and their liabilities in red. You subtract liabilities from assets. The negative number here, the negative net international investment position, means the US is a net debtor. Now, using the aggregate international investment position from the IMF, you can decompose the international investment position of the United States. And so immediately, the positive values here are the assets, below zero are the liabilities. The big yellow area is saying that, for both the asset and the liability side of the US balance sheet, portfolio investment is quite important. Just a brief digression to Brazil, actually, though. Most countries, and particular emerging markets, their balance sheet is not going to look like this. So the brown here is reserves that is essentially missing from the US balance sheet. When you think of how a lot of emerging markets, what their assets are, they're actually going to be foreign exchange reserves. Now, back to the US, going back to the aggregate balance of payments data, you can split the components of the BOP, the international investment position, even farther. So here I've split foreign direct investment into debt and equity, and portfolio investment into portfolio debt and portfolio equity. Now, again, just to look at this kind of aggregate composition, this data already lets you start seeing some of the kind of big facts in international macro. So the fact that on the liability side, this orange here, you see a lot of portfolio debt. That's saying that a lot of the US liabilities, that's where the fact that the US borrows using treasuries is going to be seen. Contrast that to the asset side, where there's a lot more portfolio equity and foreign direct investment equity. But now, for a lot of countries, so what I want to do kind of for the rest of this session is really essentially dig into, let's say you want to actually do research digging into the components of the balance of payments, the components of what countries actually own and what they owe. And so I'm going to start by digging into the portfolio equity and portfolio debt. Now, there are kind of two sources I want to cover in detail. One is on the holding side, the IMF coordinated portfolio investment survey, and then I'm going to turn to the US TIC data. Then on the issuance side, talk about the BIS international debt security statistics. Now, what is the IMF coordinated portfolio investment survey? What the IMF CPIS is, it's basically a survey at the country level, asking the different sectors of different countries, where do you own equities and debt? And so the kind of main table is the table 1. It's just reporting the geography of each country's assets. Actually, in the problem set for our session yesterday, we asked you to actually look at table 8, the derived portfolio investment liabilities. But let me give you a sense of the kind of thing you can do with CPIS. So first, CPIS is designed to look at kind of a country level aggregate that corresponds to the international investment position. And so to make that clear, what I've done is I've plotted from the international investment position in green, how much the US says it owns in foreign assets, in foreign equities on the left, and foreign bonds on the right. I've kind of overlaid that with, if you sum up each country level position in CPIS, you can actually recover essentially the entire country's international exposure. Now, what can you actually do with that? Well, instead of just saying, hey, the US owns this many billions, or in this case, trillions of dollars of equities and bonds, you can actually see where they invest. And so kind of related to something that we talked about yesterday, if you actually just look at the CPIS data, you're going to see that the major investment destination of the US is the Cayman Islands. And that's going to be because the CPIS data is on a residency basis. And so one thing when you look at this is to remember that any investment in tax havens won't immediately be unwound, but there's a lot of power in this. Immediately you can see essentially where the US is investing, and it's going to have, there's essentially the equivalent of this data for every reporting country around the world. Now, for a lot of countries, CPIS is the most disaggregated form of portfolio data you can get, which you can think of as, the location they're investing, whether it's equity, long-term debt, and short-term debt. For some other countries, it's possible to go farther. So I'm about to give you the example of the US TIC data. The ECB has a fantastic security holding statistics data that I'm not going to go into. Based on my work with Brent Matteo and Antonio Coppola on globalcapitalallocation.com, we've produced some disaggregations for those countries for which we have microdata. I've also just highlighted, if you kind of want to get a sense of who owns what around the world, these are some commercial data sets that one can turn to. And let me briefly now turn to the US TIC data. So the US Treasury International Capital data, you can think of the ambition of it is the same as CPIS, getting at, just for the US, of where does the US own stocks and bonds around the world. From this website, if you go to the annual and semi-annual reports, what you can basically get for the US is a much finer disaggregation of where the United States owns portfolio claims around the world. And so to give you a sense of what you can do for the United States using the TIC data that you couldn't do using CPIS, is you could ask the question, for instance, of what's the currency composition of US bond investment around the world. And so here you can say when the US invests in Canada versus the Caymans, how much of it is in dollars versus the country's local currency. I highlighted currency, but if you want to look at many different other disaggregations of the US international investment position, the TIC data will have kind of many other splits that exist. Now, the other main source, if you really want to dig into portfolio statistics, and in this case, it's just portfolio debt, so bonds, I would recommend the BIS international debt statistics. And so this is kind of the landing page for the BIS. Now, for the BIS international debt statistics, they have the ability to query by country, but what's very convenient, particularly for academic research, is they have very, very clean flat files that you can download to kind of start your research of every single element in there. Now, what is the BIS international debt statistics? So this is a data set that is basically to say how much do different sectors of every country issue bonds on international capital markets. And so you can say for the country quarter level, the kind of thing you could say is how much money, how much bonds have been issued in international markets by each country's banks, their non-financial corporates, and the government. They split it by, say, currency and maturity, and basically many other disaggregations of this issuance data. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that unlike CPIS and TIC, the BIS International Debt Statistics is not designed to match the international investment position data. It's after something a little bit different. And so one thing I kind of want to highlight is, if foreigners buy domestic debt or residents buy internationally issued debt, the two will differ, because what the BIS is measuring is how much issuance has taken place outside of your country. But what an international investment position is designed to measure is how much do you actually owe foreigners. And so conceptually, if a country is only borrowing from foreigners on international capital markets, these two things are going to be the same, but conceptually they're after very different things. So to give you a sense of what this would actually look like if you use it for your own data, I plotted here for 4 countries. In green is the BIS International Debt Statistics, the total amount of bonds outstanding in billions, against what each country's international investment position would say, these are the portfolio debt liabilities of the country. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, for Chile, these two series are nearly identical. And the reason for that is foreigners tend to buy only bonds that are issued in international capital markets that are issued by Chilean entities. And it doesn't look like Chileans themselves are buying these internationally issued securities. And so the two series are very, very similar. Now, for Brazil, you see a divergence that BIS International Debt Statistics is going to record less debt outstanding than the portfolio debt liabilities of the country as a whole. So why would that be? So foreign investors buy a ton of Brazilian sovereign debt that's issued onshore. So the Brazilian government issues a bond domestically, foreigners buy it. That's very much a liability of Brazil in the international investment position, but it wouldn't be an international debt security in the BIS. When you turn to looking at developed markets, and particularly major issuers of international safe assets, you can see a huge divergence. So if you look at, say, the United States, the portfolio debt liabilities of the US are kind of orders of magnitude larger in the international investment position than the internationally issued securities in the BIS. And why is that? When foreigners buy, most of the stuff that foreigners buy, the bonds of the US, they're just issued in the United States. Any US Treasury that a foreign investor owns is not going to be an international debt security, even though it's a foreign liability of the United States. Now, very briefly, I want to give you a sense of how you would turn to actually decomposing the other categories of, if you wanted to dig deeper into the other categories of a country's international investment position. So again, as I mentioned, other is mostly going to be bank lending. And so once again, I should highlight, the BIS International Debt Security Statistics and also these BIS Locational Banking Statistics and Consolidated Banking Statistics have been getting better and better over time. Hyun Shin and a lot of his collaborators have been doing fantastic work to improve this data tremendously recently. But if you want to dig into, not just how much does a country owe the rest of the world in terms of bank loans, but you actually want to see who they owe it to. It's really the BIS locational banking statistics and the consolidated banking statistics that would be the place to go. I provided a link to a great talk that Ajdiev, Shin, and Wooldridge gave at the NBR Summer Institute a couple of years ago, which is basically, they do a much better job than I could do walking through this data. But basically what you want to think of the difference between these two data sets, the locational banking statistics would record the location of a lender based on the physical location of the lender. The consolidated statistics will aggregate an entire bank according to the location of its parent. And so that's going to be the difference between the two. If you wanted to dig deeper into, kind of bank lending at the, kind of micro level, the individual loan level, it's a bit more challenging than when you look at stocks and bonds, because you can really only see that easily in commercial data sets for syndicated loans. So large loans that have kind of multiple underwriters, but there are actually a number of commercial data sets. I highlighted STC Platinum and Dealogic that many of your universities might actually have if you wanted to start kind of building up a version of this from the micro level. Now, the other component I want to discuss very briefly is foreign direct investment. And so foreign direct investment is really when you can think of, basically the definition is if you own, kind of over a certain threshold of claim on a particular entity. We usually think of it as building a factory abroad. But in fact, if you actually just own, generally it's an equity claim more than 10% of an entity, it's going to show up as foreign direct investment. Once again, the IMF has kind of a parallel to the CPIS, which was Coordinated Portfolio Investment Survey. They have the similar bilateral decomposition of basically the bilateral data set of which country invests where in terms of FDI as their CDIS, the Coordinated Direct Investment Survey. Damgard et al. Basically look at how different foreign direct investment looks if you try to undo what they call phantom FDI. So I included a link to their very nice recent working paper. The US, in terms of the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they have affiliate statistics that lets you dig significantly deeper into the US FDI than you would have when you actually just look at the FDI data from most other countries. And so actually beginning with the BEA data, and a number of researchers have kind of used the data underlying these affiliate statistics, that's going to be a place where you can kind of dig deeper if you want to look at US foreign direct investment. For commercial data, Bureau van Dijk, Orbis, and Amadeus is a very nice place to start because they have kind of detailed kind of relationships between entities in a single firm. But with that, I really want to stop and take some questions. I just want to highlight that in terms of the field, it's really remarkable, even among these data sets that I have talked about, how quickly the data has been improving. And so the BIS locational banking statistics and their international banking statistics generally, they moved to a kind of enhancements over the few recent years that have added basically more and more characteristics. And so it's actually pretty remarkable how much deeper you can dig from the international investment position just using these kind of publicly available data sources than it was possible a few years ago. And what's nice about it is for a lot of these, there are actually commercially available data sources that let you kind of go one step further from these aggregates. And so I think that frequently this is now offering the chance to revisit some of the classic questions in the field or ask new ones that simply were not possible even a few years ago. But with that, let me stop and turn to questions.